as a huge fan of walking simulators in general, I was very excited back in December when I was reading in the PlayStation magazine about Paradise Lost, a game being developed by Polyamorous and published by All In Games. Now, it came out at the end of last month, and I finally got around to reviewing it. It kind of is a mix of like a World War II alternative reality with Slavic mythology and this retro futuristic technological element, so it makes for a really unusual subterranean exploration game. Like I said, huge fan of walking simulators. For those of you who perhaps have not gone into that genre before, a walking simulator is a game with very few added mechanics other than basic exploration. You are far more focused on learning more about story than you are about, say, fighting or puzzle solving, although some of the later games do involve a few puzzle elements. My first ever exploration into walking simulators was What Remains of Edith Finch and The Stanley Parable. Now, the former of those games I love to pieces and I still play quite regularly, and get quite emotional playing. The other, I tend to consider throwing my PlayStation out the window, because it's quite infuriating. It's an important game, but it is very infuriating. Now, moving back to Paradise Lost, this game has a lot of interesting elements, tries a lot of fun things, but there's a few things that it leaves to be desired. So let's get into the proper review. Now, the game starts as you, as 12-year-old Shimon, who has walked into a strange cavernous bunker. The beginning of the game shows this kind of awful looking barren landscape of snow and no human life, in fact, no life whatsoever. And then Shimon enters the bunker. Now, very quickly on, you start to see a lot of Nazi ideology, and soon you learn that this bunker was created by the Nazis in an alternative reality to our own, where World War II extended much longer than 1945. And in fact, there was a huge nuclear fallout following battle with mainly the Russians. So the Nazis had built this huge bunker under the ground in order to protect the best and brightest of their population. But soon, although the bunker is completely empty, you very soon realise that they weren't the only people to occupy this space, and as the game progresses, you learn a little bit more about what happened in the 20 years since nuclear fallout happened. Shimon also eventually meets Ava. Ava is a young girl who is trapped somewhere in the bunker in a control room. She can access cameras and can also open certain doors for you, but you don't actually physically see her for the most part. You communicate through little microphones dotted around the bunker as well, and you slowly get to know a little bit more about both characters. Now, the graphics of this game are gorgeous. It is really beautifully created in kind of this very hyper realistic way. But from the get go, this game, for want of a better word, feels kind of clumsy, I guess. So the way that Shimon is created as a first person isn't perfect. Like, they do something which I really love when walking simulators do, which is they actually give you a body. You're not just kind of an ethereal vision. So you have feet and things, but when Shimon picks things up and when you actually see his feet, everything seems slightly out of perspective. Like, his body is too small for how like big he is and things, and the way he holds things in his hands leaves a lot to be desired. The game also has a few issues with like freezing, and like the game's trying to catch up with itself as you're playing it, and you'll occasionally see it trying to render. So like I say, it's the game's trying to catch up with itself. I also found that my run through, I had several crashes at exactly the same point in the game, so then I had to try and find like a different way of maneuvering through the space in order to not get bounced. So whilst it's not Cyberpunk 2077 on PS4 level of issues, I'd still expect better from a game that's had quite so much, positive hype given to it. Now, going back to the story, there is an awful lot of story going on in this game. But the problem I found was I always felt like I was one step behind where I should have been. You know, with most walking simulators, there are plenty of goodies and things to be found that tell you much more about this space and kind of flesh out the story, but it didn't feel like there was nearly enough of these. Like, you never really felt like you were connecting with any secondary characters, just through kind of the stories they were telling you. Instead, it was kind of, you'd find a weird piece of paper that was written by someone you never heard from again. Although I did like the inclusion of a D&D campaign at one point. But back to it, like I say, the story kind of flitted between a lot of stuff, and I never felt like I'd finished the first section before it moved on to the next section. The dialogue is good, the voice acting is very good in places, but it still comes off lacking, because I think what they were trying to go for was a kind of Firewatch style of conversation. So for anyone who hasn't played Firewatch, I thoroughly recommend the game. It's an excellent little walking simulator. And it has that very similar dynamic where you have a single person who is very isolated, walking around a space, and they talk on a walkie-talkie to someone you never actually meet. Paradise Lost is doing a very similar thing, but it never got to the same emotional depth or detail that we expect if you're going to kind of use that mechanic in a walking simulator. So I always felt like Shimon and Ava were actually more vessels to prolong the story and to kind of continue the story, rather than actual people themselves. And particularly as they are meant to be children, I never saw them actually interacting as I would expect, you know, a 12-year-old to interact with an environment. It was just little things like that that I think, if they'd been a bit tweaked and maybe a bit more considered, would have made the game much more positive in my eyes. So all of this kind of together is indicating that the game is just trying to incorporate too much stuff. You know, they seem to kind of forget where they were going in places, because by the end of the game you've basically forgotten that this is a Nazi bunker from a nuclear fallout, and it's become a completely different storyline, which we'll discuss in a minute, and I will give you a spoiler warning before I start talking about it. So I think the best example of how they kind of forgot where they were going was that at the beginning, very rapidly, Shimon goes through a series of flashbacks to do with very fairly mundane moments in the game, and they remind him of something in his past. This happens for maybe the first hour of my run through, but then never happened again. He didn't have a single other flashback until right at the end of the game. It also moves from, like I say, having all of these different ideas about, you know, what the Nazis might attempt if they had developed nuclear weapons, to then looking at the fallout of radiation and like the problems with fertility and the problems with survival, and then it becomes this quite different story about a strange religion of survivors praying to a god of the bunker who provides for them. Which again, given that Shimon says that the nuclear fallout only happened 20 years before the game is set, it doesn't seem very valid that that kind of thing would happen so quickly. You know, you go through these three very different sections very quickly. So let's move on to the end. So like I say, this is a spoiler warning. If you haven't played the game and you don't want a spoiler, this is where you're going to want to stop. And just scroll to the bottom of this post to read my 5-star reviews. So I had guessed that Ava was an AI or some kind of computer-based thing well before it was even suggested by the game. It was just that whole thing of, because they didn't give you very much detail about her, she didn't seem very real, and because she was controlling certain elements of the bunker, it was just like, yeah, she's got to be part of the computer. Which is not necessarily a bad thing. I am a person who really finds artificial intelligence and anything surrounding that, because she's not technically an AI, I find it very interesting. And I think the game at the end asks you some very interesting questions. You know, when she asks to be taken off the system and to be allowed to die, I think that's a really interesting question to ask. But I'm not sure if this was the game to be asking that question. You know, like I say, it passes itself off and promotes itself as this Nazi bunker post-nuclear fallout, and suddenly the game's not really become about that, and the decisions you make in the last 5 minutes of the game, you've never been asked to make a decision earlier in the game than that. So it kind of came as a bit of a jarring thing when suddenly you're making, you know, final decisions that will influence the outcome of the game, but then you don't really see that outcome either. So it just felt a little bit rushed at the end and a little bit different to the game that it had started off as. Ultimately, I think Paradise Lost is a really interesting addition to the walking simulator franchise. I don't think it's going to ever be registered as one of the best ones. I don't think it's going to unseat any of the games I've already mentioned. But I do think it's a fun game, and I think it's a game that people will play once and really enjoy, and it's a bit of escapism for a few hours. But then you probably won't feel the need to play it again.